to our listeners and registrants around the world and everyone online and who will be streaming in the hundreds over the course of the day. And to those who listened in on our terrific opening China panel, welcome back. And to our panelists around the world in New Delhi, in Singapore, and I think either in Calgary or in Toronto. Hello, good morning, good evening. I'll turn to you in a second, but just a housekeeping note. Again, I'm president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions and editor-in-chief and publisher of Global Brief magazine. I want to pay tribute to our hardworking team and teams, particularly to my colleague and co-founder of the Institute, who's based in The Hague, Sam Sasan Shomanesh. I'm sure he's listening. Has been a key force both in this conference and a lot of the projects we do around the world. To Faraz Honarvar, our logistics head, Zachary Pakin, who so wonderfully led panels yesterday, and colleagues near and abroad. We are talking about the second giant of Asia today in a star-studded day and panel. I want to introduce wonderful guests and friends. Ramaswamy Sudarshan is the Dean of the School of Government and Public Policy at Jindal U in New Delhi. Ramaswamy, good evening. And
thank you.
Thanks so much. Great to see you. I remember very fondly how warmly you welcomed me when I came to speak and lecture to you and colleagues about 4 or 5 years ago. And I know there are great things happening at Jindal U, so thanks for joining us. Kanti Bajpai joined us from Singapore. Kanti is one of the most talented commentators on Asia in general and has written many times for Global Brief magazine, and I'll return indeed to some of his writings soon. So thank you, Kanti, for joining us, and hello in Singapore.
Thanks and good evening.
Anvesh Jain is consistent with our tradition here at Global Brief. We try to give a platform and to advance the career and profile of some of the most talented people in the world, and indeed in Canada in particular. And Anvesh is in that tradition. He's the youngest participant in this conference by far. He's a student at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and a regular commentator both in Global Brief and internationally, and was a star in our 2-day national conference. Anvesh has written a lot about India, so Anvesh, thanks for joining us. We're going to start with Ramaswamy Sudarshan in New Delhi immediately on the question of and please, Kanti, everybody will mute until I point you out to speak, if you will. Ramaswamy Sudarshan in New Delhi, can you tell us the state of affairs intra-pandemic for India, how things have gone over the last year, and how you see the post-pandemic pivot looking for India?
Well, thank you, Irvin. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel and with Kanti. The pandemic is very much virulent right now as we speak. So to think of a post-pandemic is a little pie in the sky. It's really a very serious situation right now in the country. When the whole business began, it seemed like India was going to take very clear and firm steps, quite in contrast to that of the United States President Donald Trump, and a 21-day lockdown was announced. So that seemed like a good politically decisive move, caring for the health of the population and exhorting people to comply with the lockdown. Unfortunately, in the process of doing that, the people who announced that lockdown with very short notice did not calculate what would be its immediate repercussions. And one immediate repercussion of that was the suspension of all transport across the country and a complete amnesia about the existence of millions of migrant workers. And if anybody with a modicum of human psychology would know that if there's no work to be done and there is the threat of a serious disease or illness, you want to be with your family. And several thousands of migrant workers decided to return to their families without any transport or assistance. So it was almost like a situation where, it could have been, Charles Metcalfe talking about Indian villages. They kind of depend on themselves, they're self-reliant. And so people in that spirit decided to walk. So, and then the lockdown got lifted, but one unfortunate consequence of that was that there would have been people working in the cities who, when the lockdown is lifted and provided some special transport to be able to get to their villages, would have been transmitters of COVID, which may have never reached those places. So the idea of declaring a nationwide lockdown to demonstrate that you could actually call upon the people to follow a directive was unfortunate. And now we are in a situation where, you are concerned about reviving the economy, reviving jobs. And so the lockdown has been lifted and various relaxations have been made. And we are now in a very, very serious situation with, I think, the number of people affected by COVID coming to nearly 10 million, second only to the United States. The number who have died is nearing 140,000, which, as it happens, is a relatively low rate of mortality. But the economy has taken a very, very bad hit as a result of this. And we just got the figures yesterday for the gross domestic product of the country. It's declined by 7.5%. The earlier decline, the earlier quarter was 24%. So in that sense, it's an improvement, but it's still a decline. So technically, economists would say India is in a recession, thanks to the consequences of the lockdown. And the government's measures have been somewhat understated. You would have thought that there would have been much more confidence in public expenditure to kind of help small and medium enterprises, to help people tide over the crisis. But that hasn't really been forthcoming. So there seems to be a kind of a monetarist, neoliberal mindset, a kind of valorization of protecting the fiscal deficit, even in these circumstances. And the modality, of course, fortunately, India has had a public distribution system to get food to people, and this employment guarantee scheme, which was ridiculed by the government when it came into office 5 years ago, that this is a handout mechanism and we should do away with it. But that is in fact a lifeline for millions of families right now. So it's difficult to say when this might end. Of course, the vaccine would make a big difference. And in all of these things, the government and the Prime Minister has been very, he has a very decisive style. The announcement of the lockdown for 21 days across the country was done in 4 hours notice. But yesterday, he visited Hyderabad, Ahmedabad, Pune, and he visited the institutions working on vaccines and development of those to demonstrate to the country that he cares, that the government cares. That so there is a kind of a curious combination of what might appeal to the public as a leader who cares about their welfare and what is actually the real consequence of those measures or those gestures. So, political scientists can try to figure out this particular style of leadership, which, which demonstrates a caring and a concern for the population, but in what it is actually doing, it's not terribly intelligent, I would say.
Sudarshan, a very quick question before we head to Kanti in 1 or 2 minutes time. The hospital situation in India vis-a-vis COVID, and also things that are unaddressed, diagnoses that are or surgeries that have been delayed. Secondly, the schooling situation. Are there many kids not in school in India? It's a problem often in India, but has it been amplified considerably by the pandemic? And finally, are there significant numbers of businesses that have gone out of existence during the last year because of the pandemic?
Yeah, just to answer those questions, we anticipated that there would be a phenomenal overrun and demand on our hospital situation. But I suppose, the pandemic did help in equipping a number of hospitals with the necessary infrastructure to get ventilators and so on. But as it turned out, the fatality and the seriousness of COVID-19 in India has not been as it seems to be in Europe or in the United States. I don't know, scientists may say maybe it's a milder strain of the virus, but the government commissioned a whole lot of people, companies to manufacture ventilators. There's a bit of a scam in that, I would argue. But a number of ventilators remain unused. So even if you open the newspaper today and to see, how many ventilators are there in use in Delhi and how many are not used, the number that's not used is greater. So it somehow seems to be that the fatality rate and the seriousness of the virus and the pressure that it has put on hospitals is less than was anticipated. But in terms of governance and administration, what it has done is that out of abundant caution, a number of hospitals have been commissioned to be exclusively COVID-19 hospitals. But what that means is that a whole lot of people with other complaints of health and in serious need of attention have been left out because the hospitals won't take them in because they're not COVID-19 patients. So there may be serious situations of somebody with acute appendicitis or serious respiratory problems unconnected to COVID. So there are all of those familiar problems that we have with our governance. So that's with respect to the health infrastructure. I don't think it's collapsed. It's coped. With respect to educational institutions, they've remained closed. And there's been much toing and froing. This is one of those instances where India demonstrates, what kind of a governance system we have. The University Grants Commission wanted universities to conduct their final examinations for all students. State governments like Maharashtra said, no, we can't let, under these circumstances, have students take final exams. Let us extrapolate their performance in previous semesters to this one. And then as in most things, it ended up with the Supreme Court of India having to adjudicate as to whether the University Grants Commission is correct or not. And they tried to do a Solomon-like thing by saying the UGC is right, we can't let our standards down. However, the time given for completion of those exams can be extended and postponed. So most institutions remain closed.
What about elementary schools? Elementary schools, secondary?
Now that is, no, they're all they're all claiming to be doing online teaching, but it's only 1 in 4 children in this country have access to a smartphone. Never mind a laptop. Laptop, forget it. Just a smartphone on which you may be able to listen to the lecture or later listen to a recording of the lecture is available to 1 child out of every 4. So it reminds me of this, what was that? There was this, I don't know if you recall, there was this hit song of Alice Cooper, that went, no more pencils, no more books, no more teachers, dirty looks. Well, we got no class, out for summer, out for fall, we might not come back at all. School's out forever, school's out with fever. So that seems to be the situation with respect to elementary schools and children. I'm thinking of a 72 hit, but those words, I think, apply right now. And it's a very unfortunate situation. I think a whole generation of students are going to be seriously disadvantaged because this pretense that, it's all right for some of us in Jindal Global University and so on to have access to Zoom and to say, oh, why didn't we think of this? Why didn't I think of having Irvin, educate my students on this platform all these years? And why is it I'm discovering that this is a great platform thanks to COVID? But that's not the case with millions and millions of school children. It's a very, very tragic situation.
Okay, we'll return to the economic one. That tragedy is, I'm aware of it. I think people are under aware of it in North America, where we have it in our own backyard, in the hundreds of thousands in Canada, and in the millions in the United States. It's unthinkable that it could have happened in just a few months' time, but obviously it's amplified in India, albeit Henry Wang in our last panel, in our opening panel, suggested that it was not an issue at all in China. So by way of segue, I'm going to ask Kanti to look at the response to the pandemic in Southeast Asia, which you inhabit, and also China, and contrast that with what you see happening in India and South Asia more generally. Demute Kanti. Hi, Kanti.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, Southeast Asia has had a pretty good record amongst the best. And it prompts us to think that there is an Asian way, or at least an East Asian way. So Thailand has done really very well. Vietnam's been a success story until very, very recently. Most of the smaller Southeast Asian countries on the mainland have kept the numbers low. The exceptions are Malaysia on the mainland partly, and of course now Indonesia, which is surging somewhat. Singapore, after the initial problem really with workers, foreign labor who were packed into relatively tight dorms, has now wrestled the problem to the ground. So there are no foreign workers with COVID. Only 25 people or so have died. And community transmission is basically is over. We haven't had a community transmission for 2 weeks and just one today, I think. Yeah, about 55,000 people got it, but it's really an enormous success story. And it's we're pretty much back to normal here. You're masked up and you have to do contact tracing and all of that, but we can go to work, to the stores, to the malls, to the restaurants, and so on and so forth. And there's a third phase of opening up that's probably coming. In East Asia, I mean, I think a bit further away, you probably heard about it in the previous panel. I think East Asia is a bit more mixed, Japan, Korea. China, of course, is a somewhat mixed story, obviously with the beginnings in Wuhan, but then the kind of very great success they've had in controlling it, despite some outbreaks here and there. So I think one of the big sets of lessons and puzzles here is why the rest of the world hasn't looked at the Southeast Asian or East Asian experience and tried to emulate it. And what is that experience? Basically, initially a lockdown, a very firm lockdown, accompanied by social distancing if you did have to get out for any reason, shopping, accompanied by compulsory mask wearing in all public spaces for everyone, punishable usually by fines and so on, particularly in Singapore, and contact tracing. Brilliantly executed in, I think, in about half of Southeast Asia, I would say, or somewhat less. In Singapore, outstanding. It's on an app and a phone. And so it seems like East Asia, I mean, of course, China had a very brutal lockdown in Wuhan and Beijing and other places. But I have students in China who have not come to Singapore because they fear getting it. But they're walking around the streets of Shanghai without masks on, Beijing, they're going out, they're frolicking and partying and are in the streets. So I think one of the things that comes across to me is that there's a fairly simple technology, as it were, for dealing with this pandemic until the vaccine kicks in, that Southeast Asia and East Asia have applied brilliantly, probably unlike any other place except maybe bits of Scandinavia and of course, New Zealand and Australia. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the world is morally reprehensible or there, a whole bunch of village idiots out there. They have their cultures, and I think one has to kind of understand that. But Southeast Asia and East Asia has its own, and I think there's a general sense that of trust in government and experts, which a lot of the rest of the world, particularly ironically in the Western world, seems to be in doubt. I think in Singapore, if the government says, here's a technology, masking, contact tracing, et cetera, stay at home, work from home, it'll protect you, most overwhelming number of people accept that. And they trust the government on things like vaccines and care and treatment and the figures that are being handed out. So I think, those are some of the ingredients that have really worked here in Asia. I quite understand, for instance, in India, that there's such a different kind of socioeconomic, spatial context, which makes things very difficult. I mean, Sudarshan talked about, for instance, the non-availability of connectivity, of smartphones, and so on. So that really inhibits your ability to do aggressive contact tracing, for instance. You have millions of people packed into very small spaces in tenements, in slums, in other urban spaces or peri-urban spaces, which Southeast Asia by and large doesn't have. The exceptions being Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines, and they're the three that have had a fair struggle with COVID. So I think sensitive to these kinds of differences across the world, culture, spatiality, forms of governance, trust in government and science and expertise. I think East Asia, Southeast Asia comes across as a success story. So I think there are lessons nonetheless to be learned from Southeast Asia, but I quite understand that other regions, other countries, other cultures may not be altogether able to emulate them. So it's on balance. I mean, the economy has been hit pretty badly everywhere, but nothing, fortunately, as bad as India. So there's a relatively optimistic view. We'll probably come to it later, but the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, has just been signed. And I think there's a kind of genial optimism that will, help get countries over the hump as well. And then, of course, there's the vaccine to come. So let me just stop there. But I think on COVID and on the economy, there's a genially optimistic view here in Southeast Asia and East Asia.
Kanti, thank you. Before we return to Anvesh, we will definitely return to the RCEP, which came up with prominence in the opening panel on China. The second thematic in our conference after post-pandemic is post-US election. It's not the center of the world, but it's one of the major forces right now. How should India interpret the new administration in Washington? Kanti.
Was that to me? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were
Kanti. Before we turn to Anvesh, yeah, Kanti. How should the U.S. How should Modi and the leadership in New Delhi interpret the new government in Washington incoming?
Well, as it happens, my column today in the Times of India is on the subject. So let me just make a couple of points from that. The first is that, I think there's a sense that there will be greater predictability with Biden in the world. And that's good for everyone, including India. Much as India got used to Trump and Modi was comfortable with him, I think that there's a premium on predictability as well in the world. And I think the Indian government, with others, is looking forward to a more predictable kind of United States and therefore a more predictable world, hopefully. I think they're also looking forward to some of the kind of blaring and shouting via tweets and so on, which can discombobulate anyone, including India, for that to come down. So I think some sense of return to a kind of normal United States. I think there's a sense, though, that there are 2 or 3 challenges, perhaps, with the Americans. The first relates to the issue of China, of course, above all. And I guess we'll come to China later. But the broad reading, I think, is that there will be a bit of a reset on the part of the Biden administration towards China and between India and China. So some rebalancing, because the Biden administration takes a more liberal view of how to achieve security, even with China. So I think that's the first and probably the most challenging issue for Delhi as it looks at Biden. How much is he going to reset with China, and how much is there going to be a rebalancing of India-China in the Biden administration's view? I think the second challenge is that it's great that Biden will be better with allies in East Asia, but particularly in Europe as well. But that also means that a good bit of policy attention will now be diverted to the transatlantic relationship and Russia, who Biden has already marked out as an even bigger problem security-wise than China. And that probably inevitably means a certain amount of attention going away from the Indo-Pacific and India in particular as well. So I think there's a concern that India will have to work harder to be on the radar screen with the Biden administration than it was with the Trump administration. So I think that's the second point. I think the third is related to trade. There is a trade agreement with the United States on the table that they didn't sign at the end because it got too close to the presidential election and so on. Unclear whether Biden would sign that. A Democratic president, as much as anybody else, but perhaps more so, has to be very careful now about middle class and working class constituencies in America, and whether a trade deal with the Americans means loss of jobs, loss of incomes for American workers, white collar people. I mean, I think that's, there's going to be sensitivities there. So I think Delhi has a concern as well on the trade front. So I think those are 3 just quick points that I'll throw out there about the Biden administration.
Just one quick supplementary, Kanti, and Anvesh, I'm going to tee you up in just a second. 1 minute. More importantly than the Times of India, on which I congratulate you, Kanti, by the way, very timely. More important than Times of India, of course, you wrote in Global Brief magazine a few years ago about Indian school or tradition of grand strategy, and I wonder whether you see in the coming plays from Modi as they survey the situation in the United States, any elements, any traces of some sort of strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, we're going to come to it, but the whole summer of discontent this year with China, I think has brought home one thing pretty clearly, that India is going to have to bridge the power gap with China. The attempt, from 1988 to about 2015 or 2016, to try to normalize with China as a way of softening up China to the point that there would be a border agreement, clearly seems to have failed, at least on one reading in the Modi camp. And Doklam was probably, the high point of that doubt, or the lack of, success of that strategy. And from there on, there was a kind of shift slowly towards a sense that India had to begin to catch up in the power game, that a liberal approach towards China simply wasn't going to work. And that one had to maybe flip the logic on its head, which is, as Modi said, please get peace and tranquility on the border, and let's start to move on an agreement on the border, and then we'll do more normalization. And he went with that for about 3 years, from about Doklam or just before to 2020. And that didn't work out so well. That's Doklam, that's Ladakh, 2020. And now I think there's a view that, there is only one way really to deal with China, and that is to go back to a kind of Indira Gandhi period towards China, which is we've got to, through self-sufficiency, batten down the hatches, build military power, and try and bridge the gap with the Chinese and deter them until they get to the point where we can carry out a more equal conversation, man to man, woman to woman across the table, and solve this problem. So I think that what we're going to see with the Modi administration going forward is, and we've seen it in this kind of policy of self-reliance in arms production, in the economy, is to now desperately try to bridge the power gap and speak to China from a position of relative strength. So I think it seems to me that that's the move that they're hoping to make.
Okay, let's return to that soon, Kanti. Anvesh, welcome. Kanti, if you could mute there. Anvesh, welcome. You are in Toronto or Calgary?
I'm in Toronto, actually.
Okay, welcome, and great to have you back. Tell us what we in Canada understand properly or don't understand properly about India, first and foremost, and then the Canada-India relationship specifically.
Sure. Well, first I want to say namaste and thank you for this opportunity, and also to be here with such esteemed fellow panelists. I think the Canadian perspective on India is it's one that Canada, its foreign policy, its tradition has been very localized for a long time. It was very insular. It was one that looked to its primary relationships across the transatlantic. So traditionally that was Great Britain, the hegemonic benefactor, and then from the 1930s, 1940s onwards, the United States, and that relationship has obviously grown a lot closer until the Trump administration. So for a long time, Canada didn't actually have a lot of room for a country like India in its strategic periphery, but there were attempts. I mean, the St. Laurent and Pearson governments, they were interested in India, and they had a lot of praise for Nehru. There were convergences there. One major area that people don't really think about or talk about in a country that is very important strategically for both India and the West nowadays is Vietnam. And there's a history of accommodation and history of coordination there with the International Control Commissions of the 1950s and the 1960s. And Canada's mission there and India's mission there lasted for 18 years. That's 18 years of having to sit there, the Indians, the Poles, and the Canadians, and working side by side. And in some ways, that experience turned off a generation of Canadian diplomats from Indian methods as well, because India was the neutral party there. The Poles were the communists, and Canada obviously represented the West. And there were a lot of times when India didn't take the line or tack with Poland or the Vietnamese that Canada hoped it would. And in a lot of ways that hardened Canadian resolve towards the Cold War, but also alienated Canada-India relations for a while, which was actually something that they weren't trying to do. So something that I think the West more broadly needs to realize about India is that this is a country with its own long civilizational history and its own concept of foreign relations, its own concept of history, its own worldview, its own method of looking at the world and its own strategic universe. And that often won't align with or comply with Western expectations. And part of this is why you're seeing one of the things that Mr. Bajpai very astutely talked about was how the Biden administration is going to pivot into this transition. And I think there's an Indian optimism, or at least a hope, that some of the broad convergences will continue. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But the issue is that there's also a historical distrust of the West as well. And I mean, who can blame them? For a long time, the United States wasn't exactly looking out for India's best interests, or Canada or other Western countries. They were looking at India as a tool against first the Soviets, which was unacceptable to the Indians. And now there's a fear or a concern that India will also be used as a pawn against the Chinese, which is not viable or favorable either. So coming to India as a strategic actor, but also as a strategic equal, a country with its own interests and its own passions and ideas, I think that kind of respect needs to be there, and it historically hasn't been. I think Canada, the relationship can in some ways be summed up by this big picture convergence, but then, Justin Trudeau going over there and dressing like I'm dressed right now, except every single day. That wasn't a very good look, and it kind of shows the kind of exoticization and orientalist viewpoint that we can sometimes have towards a country as complex as India.
Anvesh, if you were to advise Joe Biden and his team, Jake Sullivan, who is a friend of Global Brief as well, and some of his coterie on moves towards India, what would your advice be to Washington? And then what would your advice be to Ottawa in the context of a new Biden administration in its relationship with New Delhi?
Yeah, I think the story of India and the United States in the 21st century is going to be one of broad strategic convergence. There's just simply too many interests, too many shared values, and too many shared ideas and notions about the world that are going to align. I think what I would say to the Joe Biden administration is that obviously you ran on rejecting a lot of Trump's flavor and personality and ideas of domestic politics, but don't be afraid to incorporate some of his administration's successful ideas on foreign policy. I think the free and open Indo-Pacific concept is one that deserves follow-up. It's something that you need to follow up with those partnerships that the Trump administration managed to bring a larger focus and a light to. I think it's difficult to say that Trump didn't in some ways expand the American strategic conception of India. Whether that was, obviously him, I'm not sure about, but definitely there were actors and agents in his administration that thought it was worthwhile to pursue this kind of partnership with India. And this isn't a partisan thing either. I mean, you saw similar bonhomie between Modi and Barack Obama in the early years. So I think regardless of who's in power in the White House, there are too many similarities, there's too many shared values and a shared concept. It's just the amount of support that the United States, or how much they're choosing to lean into expanding their strategic universe when it comes to India. I think oftentimes, as Mr. Bajpai pointed out, if you return to normal, that often means a return to the transatlantic. It means a return to familiar conceptions of foreign policy, like Russia, like the transatlantic relationship. And that opening up your mind to the possibilities of what could be there in the future with a country like India, or also with other actors in East Asia, like Japan, Taiwan. Not even that. I mean, Canada's own historical relationships with its own continent. There are countries out there like Chile and Argentina that are very open to being part of this expanded concept of the Club of Democracies, or the Western world, or those who are in defense of whatever remains of the liberal international order. And so the question is how much resources and how much mental space, the mental map that these diplomats and strategic thinkers are creating, where does it include countries in Asia? Where does it include a country as vast and kind of mystic as India? That's the question that needs to be asked in both DC and also Ottawa in terms of the tack it wants to take.
Thank you, Anvesh. We'll return to some of those pieces in a second. And now back to the mystical in New Delhi. Sudarshan, you wrote a piece recently. I remember you sent us an early draft for comments. It was excellent on either in the Hindu or in the Times of India on nationalism in India, and how you thought that was a force that was increasingly either amplified or untamed. And I wonder how that nationalism is manifesting itself now after the summer of discontent with China, first and foremost, Sudarshan, and secondly, after the pandemic.
Yeah, that was a piece I wrote for the Hindu very soon after what happened in the Ladakh region, cautioning against a kind of a knee-jerk reaction of let's, whipping up the country into some anti-China fervor. And when I wrote it, I was actually concerned about incidents that had previously happened with respect to citizens of India from the Northeast who were studying in Bangalore and Pune and cities like that, who were regarded as Chinese looking and attacked. And I was concerned that, yes, so China has been an aggressor. We are all upset about it, but it will turn, people into, taking these kinds of actions against our own citizens. Secondly, I wanted to point out that, for instance, particularly in the context of the pandemic, one of India's successes has been its pharmaceutical industry and the fact that it has produced drugs. In the case of HIV/AIDS, the drugs manufactured in India made a big difference. There were disputes in South Africa about those, use of those generic drugs. But the fact remains that about 70% of the ingredients that go into these drugs that India manufactures comes from China. And so particularly in the context of a pandemic like this, when we are, desperately looking for drugs, treatments, vaccines, and so on, it's not the time to say, oh, no, we will not have anything Chinese coming into our country. Unfortunately, that's the reaction. And I don't know. I mean, this is a wild kind of a statement. I think that, we have been pretty harsh in terms of curtailing dissent against government policies. We took an initiative to change the status of Jammu and Kashmir. And in that context, there was a military person who actually said that we may have to take these Kashmiris in the valley and put them through a re-education program so that they learn that, they ought to be true and patriotic citizens of India. And he hinted that this is what the Chinese have done with the Uyghur population, put them through some re-education thing so that they set aside their religious and other sentiments and say they belong to this great nation and they will have economic prosperity and so on. So this is very disturbing. So on the one hand, the attitude to China is, oh, no, let's ban all these TikTok and a whole lot of Chinese apps, which people in India have been happily using. And then to say, oh, well, China can do this. Look how they're treating the demonstrators in Hong Kong. We will not let the bloody farmers come from Punjab to Delhi seeking a conversation with the law minister. We'll put water cannons on them. We'll stop them. Right now, a few kilometers from where I'm talking, are thousands of farmers on the Haryana-Delhi border who have said, oh, you can use some Nirankari camp, just inside Delhi. Firstly, the government wanted the Delhi administration to declare a stadium as a prison, so they could all be formally charged and kept imprisoned, as it were. Now, this is the kind of, so India is in a paradox, we seem to want to learn some lessons from China about how to deal with protests in Hong Kong. And at the same time, we are saying, no, China is, so I think there's complete confusion in how to deal with these things and the kinds of signals it sends on both counts. On the count of hostility to China over a border dispute. In fact, it's a border dispute that's unresolved. So there will be a dispute. You can't expect China to say, we'll accept the British colonial lines and so on, and that's fixed forever. So they will say, no, we think this is our territory. And we say, no, we haven't resolved this border. We have to sort it out. So that can happen. So why don't you take it in that spirit? Instead of saying, we will ban Chinese apps, we will issue no visas. And this is a serious concern for us because, In our university, we have Chinese nationals who come to teach, and their visas are in question. This is very, short-sighted, I would say. But the more worrying thing, and this is about, all this great talk about, West versus East Asia and rising and so on, is that these methods that are used by governments in China and India trying to emulate some of them is not a great thing at all. And as for China being a great champion of our multinational institutions and the Human Rights Commission and the United Nations and its values, I'm sorry, I don't have Kishore Mahbubani's great faith that they are great multilateralists and so on. They are a danger to the multilateral system that we now have. And it's better that India recognizes that, but at the same time, for its, for trade is always good. It's a pity India walked out of the RCEP. It does great disservice to the Indian population and Indian consumers. It's very short-sighted. And so we will behave like China, but we will be anti-China, doesn't seem to be a very sensible policy in my view. But then, there are more knowledgeable people. I'm not an expert on international relations.
Sudarshan, notwithstanding your claim to non-expertise, we're going to play on your considerable expertise. And now, given that confusion you've painted strategically, what is your advice to the Modi government, humbly, or the leadership, or thought leaders in India, which you're one, in terms of postural preparation for the new government in Washington?
No, I think the Modi government has to, wind down all this talk about nationalism, to regard anyone who criticizes the government and its policies as anti-national, and to wind down this anti-China fervor as well, to pragmatically and realistically recognize that trade with China is of great advantage to our country, that in fact, much of our current dependence on China and the import of intermediaries is pretty crucial, and our economy is in a pretty bad way. And so, not to have this anti-China rhetoric to say, oh, we can stand up, we will flex our muscles, we will be great, we will not let an inch of our territory go. All of that rhetoric, I think, should be toned down with vis-a-vis that. At the same time, there's no point in emulating what China might be doing with respect to dealing with dissent and protests. China seems to have become India's guru, and I think that's got to stop as well. So I think that's if the present regime doesn't recognize this, we are setting in store, because all of this kind of rhetoric about nationalism and, we will stand up against China and so on, will only take you some distance, in election here and there. But I think ultimately the plight of our population, the extent to which women in this country have been hurt by the pandemic, by no attention to how you might creatively, imaginatively deal with them, is going to create great unrest. The farmers' unrest, I don't think is, it may be that they don't understand that the laws passed by the Modi regime they've lost trust in the Modi regime, which is why they're protesting. But in terms of the practical consequences of those laws, it's not going to be greatly damaging to the agricultural sector or to farmers. But what it signals is distrust of the government, on the part of a very, very important constituency in this country, the farmers. I mean, Mrs. Gandhi was shaken when Mahendra Tikayat came from Western UP and had 300,000 farmers in front of on India Gate. That was something to be seen. The farmers in India are capable of it. I think this government's got to wake up, and instead of deflecting attention to the serious crisis, the economic crisis and the pandemic and the management of this pandemic, instead of deflecting that with ordinances saying that someone who converts to another religion in order to marry another person will now be criminally prosecuted, should take permission of the district magistrate. Such things are, I can't understand. Even the farmers' laws, why do you want to bring that in now? Why do you want to bring an ordinance on mixed marriages at this point in time when we are dealing with a major, major crisis, the pandemic and its consequences on all people, on education, on health, on poverty, on livelihoods? That's got to be the single-minded attention. So in that sense, I mean, I don't know whether, we should be too harsh on Donald Trump, saying, oh, forget the pandemic, we are going to concentrate on, these things, and whipping up a fervor about, jobs being stolen or immigrants and so on, completely deflecting issues, not addressing the serious problems the country is facing right now.
Thank you, Sudarshan, for your candor. And Kanti, by way of juxtaposition, I want to turn to you, and questions starting to come into the team directly from around the world. First of all, can you respond to Sudarshan's missive about rights, responsibilities, balances, tensions, performance in India versus China, and how they compare to one another, given different cultures, given contexts, what they can learn from each other. And then I'll once you're done with that, I want to turn to the RCEP.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing that that Sudarshan's pointed out, which is particularly this government, and particularly something like some of the Hindu right-wing organizations, they've been studying China very closely, quietly. And what they're interested in is how the Chinese Communist Party seeps into every corner of Chinese existence to the most micro level and manages Chinese existence politically, socially, economically. And so, it's a point that most people don't know, but I think Sudarshan raised an interesting point, which is that this government, more than any government, admires many aspects of Chinese governance, including dealing with dissent, micromanaging, seeping into the remotest corners of Indian life to control what people do and say. I think, there's an ambition there, which is a very flawed one in a country as big as India and as diverse and with a history of resisting these kinds of things. If you combine that with the kind of very centralized way of governing that Mr. Modi specializes in, you can see that there could be a real problem here. And many of the difficulties that in COVID and the handling of the economy, even before COVID, came out of Modi surrounding himself with a very small coterie of people and trying to run India like he ran Gujarat state. And even there, his record was not the greatest, to be honest. Most people can point out all kinds of difficulties even there. But running a country as big as India with just a few people, like a Politburo almost, around him, I think has had its limitations. Demonetization and the disaster around that is one part of that. Very badly rolled out GST was another. The hundreds, as Sudarshan said, of kind of notifications on COVID that came out that were incomprehensible to most people. which give an illusion of doing something, but actually just confusing the hell out of the population and being impractical anyway. So I think, there's a real question around Mr. Modi's style of governance. I mean, he is a great campaigner, very eloquent, he's very clever. He keeps up with trends and what's going on. He can be decisive and I think make good decisions. But in fact, over 6 years, the record is rather average in terms of governance. So I think, if you look at what, give you an example of now of where India is placed with respect to China. The GDP gap today is over $11 trillion. India's at about 2.87 or something. China's at 13 or 14 or whatever it is. Now we can do the PPP calculations and all of that, but and there are doubts about all kinds of figures, but it's a huge gap. When China grows at 3 to 4% or whatever it is, it grew 2% I think during COVID. That's on a base of 13 to 14 trillion dollars. So the enormous absolute difference between these two economies, India is heading towards becoming a kind of medium power. Very comfortable in a sense in the third tier. The United States still number one, China number two. I think India's taken a great leap forward in terms of some of the things Modi has done to take a great leap back like China did in the 1950s. We have now vaulted back from position, trying to be in the second rank with China to the third rank with France and Britain. We're roughly at the same GDP. All three countries have one aircraft carrier. All three countries have about the same number of nuclear weapons. I mean, there's absolutely no comparison between India and China. And that gap is going to grow over the next 3 to 5 years. So there's an enormous problem for India. And I think what India has not grasped is that it's got to, it embarked on a direction under Manmohan Singh and the Bajpai government before, and for a little while under Modi. And I think that's what should have carried on. Unfortunately, in the second term, Modi has gone into identity politics, and to address Sudarshan's point about his exasperation over, well, what on earth are they doing all these things about, the love jihad and taking aim at minorities over the most trivial things and so on and so forth, worrying about even the citizenship. I mean, it is intended to deflect attention from a very, very serious crisis. And by the way, and I'll just end on this note, there's a perfect storm coming, not just over COVID and the economy, or even the treatment of women, gender, education, and so on. There's enormous water shortages. India today has 20% of the water availability per capita that it did at independence. The average Indian has only 20% of the amount of water they did 70 years ago. Climate change is wreaking havoc. There are other disease vectors India leads in, tuberculosis, et cetera, et cetera. There's the urbanization of the population, crowding. India is going to plateau out at 1.7 billion people in a country that's 40% the size of China in land area. So, I mean, there's a concatenation possibly of all these, including identity politics, which Mr. Modi should have left well alone, which he's kind of opening up. It's scary. Whereas China, frankly, has addressed a lot of these issues and continues to. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, very quickly, within a couple of minutes, to each of these points, and then we'll turn to Anvesh and then some closing remarks. Coming in from the team and from listeners around the world, India's reaction to RCEP, what should it be? And beyond that, Kanti, when I came to speak with Sudarshan and colleagues at the Jindal U in the School of Government and Public Policy, then I went to speak with officials in the government of New Delhi. On behalf of the Institute, we were proposing an algorithm to exit the Western Russia conflict over Ukraine at the time, which has since ballooned to Syria and other theaters. And the algorithm that has some resonance in a number of leading countries around the world was the idea of third nation or third bloc peacekeepers in the Donbass, and it would be led by a peacekeeping country like India, which is putatively neutral. And there was some intellectual sympathy, but not much intellectual ken about the situation. Most importantly, to my surprise, not much strategic chutzpah. India doesn't seem to have a strategic vision beyond its immediate region, or doesn't have a tradition or great courage to float world-saving algorithms, as you would see in the case of the United States, obviously Britain, France historically, China, and Russia. And was I reading it correctly? Does India still have a little bit of strategic provincialism today, given its as against its big size?
Yeah, let me take the RCEP and second, but because I think it leads on from the answer to the first, which is that I think you're right. I mean, S. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, has just written a book, The India Way, and before that he was talking about India, as I said a few minutes ago, about India being a leading power. And the idea of that was that India would be exactly what you're talking about. It would be creative on the world stage, would reinvigorate multilateralism, it would reconnect to the global south, it would pursue a bigger coalition in global politics that would try to bridge and kind of provide alternatives to the Chinese on one side and the Americans on the other. It all sounded very Nehruvian, actually, without of course ever invoking the term non-alignment, because Mr. Modi can't abide that term. He's never used it in the 6 years he's been in office. So that was a vision, and it was a kind of idea that a positive one, but also a strategic one, because in a sense, India would cobble together also a sort of pressure group against both the Chinese and the Americans, who might ride roughshod over everybody else. Come to the summer of 2020, suddenly that discourse about a leading power, configured in the way that Jaishankar was talking about it, as this kind of good-natured multilateralist, but also strategically minded third force, began to look very dicey. And what you've seen is India kind of more perhaps than ever before inclined towards the United States, Australia, and all of that. The Quad we haven't quite gone all the way. I think Anvesh's point about India will always somewhat keep to its own way and hold off being part of a larger alliance-like coalition. But in fact, it's very substantially at the moment moved over and declared its hand. And that's not the leading power idea that that Jaishankar was talking about, presumably with Modi's blessings. Now come to RCEP. I think RCEP, does show a lack of ambition. I mean, really, and it's been the Indian government's trying to salvage it by saying, trying to salvage its decision to stay out of it by saying, oh well, we've got all these bilateral trade agreements anyway. Well, yes, you do, but this is a much larger entity, and operating in it is a strategic issue. It is very much the case that India's presence there is a reassurance to the smaller countries, shows willpower, shows kind of regional, global, and global good citizenship, and an ability to, in a good way, balance out other players, particularly China. I agree with Sudarshan that India doesn't have to beat the drum all constantly about anti-Chineseness, but a good balance against China and Asia is perfectly all right. And it's just thrown that away. So and it's rewarding special interests in India, who frankly should probably be, a process of creative destruction should get rid of inefficient producers in back home in India, and that's what the RCEP would have probably done. So having complained that we were never part of APEC, we were kept out of ASEAN and Southeast Asia for a long time. We've now taken ourselves out of RCEP, left the field open to the Chinese. And of course, the other possibility is the CPTPP, which there's not a hope in hell we'll join because its social and other standards are even more severe. So we're completely almost out of the multilateral trade game in all of Asia. So if you add it all up, I mean, it's very disappointing where India's ended up, frankly.
Kanti, thank you. We'll return to you and Sudarshan in a moment. Anvesh, can you tell us what we asked this of Stephen Wang in our last panel on China? What do young North Americans, in Canada in particular, North America in general, what do they need to learn about India? How can we improve social connections, intellectual connections, exchanges, so that there's a tightening between the societies and civilizations, so that there's not this oversimplification as we have, I think, with both China and India in the West. These they're not even stereotypes; they're just reductions on social media to often absurdities, which leave us at a block in practice.
Yeah, well, I think the basis of any good fundamentals of international relations is an understanding of history and an understanding of geography. And when you understand these two things, you have a very potent ability to better understand the society that you're talking about and really understanding where it comes from and what its perspectives are on a variety of issues. So I think India has a couple fortes in that regards, especially with its relationship with Canada and Canadian youth. That Indian culture here is prevalent. It's loved, and there's a very active and engaged diaspora that actually does care about India's image. It does care about its reputation. And Minister Jaishankar himself has talked about this. He's specifically outlined the Indian diaspora as a key forte of Indian foreign policy, namely because unlike a lot of other histories of emigre movement or diasporas, a lot of the India's historical diaspora population doesn't have an enmity towards the state. And there could be criticisms, there could be disagreements of opinion. But by and large, the relationship between the Indian diaspora and the motherland is one of love and appreciation and a longing for that connection. And you've seen this borne out over, not just recent diaspora populations in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom, which are beginning to enter high levels of politics, which are beginning to influence policy in a very significant way. You've seen Indian interest groups influencing American policy in Kashmir. You've seen Indian ministers or of Indian origin, such as Rishi Sunak or Preeti Patel in the United Kingdom, who are a very, very high level of politics. And there's a positive relationship there, not just for the recent populations, but for the historical populations in the West Indies and South Africa. Everybody knows that Mahatma Gandhi himself, he got his start in independence politics in South Africa. So there's a strong relationship there. And I think India's diaspora population wants to act as a representative, and it cares about these things. It cares about what happens back in India. It cares about the politics. I know in Canada, there's a very significant Punjabi Canadian community, and I've already seen there's a lot of interest and discussion around what's happening with the farm protests back in India and the agricultural sector of Punjab. So, going even beyond that, the point is that this segment of the population, this diaspora, is increasing. India has one of the most, I think, potent diasporas in the entire world. If you look at remittances, remittances from the Indian diaspora back to India is one of the largest in the world. India has one of the largest diaspora populations in the world. I think 18 million was the last official count from the United Nations, but it's complicated to measure these things. I'm sure it's much higher nowadays. There's an Indian diaspora population in pretty much every country in the world. And if you look at India-Canada relations in particular, the students are a major factor, the university sector, the education sector. And there's a lot of questions nowadays around kind of Chinese students coming to Canada or Chinese graduates coming to Canada and kind of the information economy there, patents. There's a lot of questions nowadays being raised over the stealing of IP or technology. But I don't think you see that same suspicion with Indian students. In fact, a lot of people have been keen to welcome more Indian students, and not just into the big cities like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, but you're actually seeing a lot of Indian students in very small localities across Canada, in the smaller colleges or technical schools. And that's the kind of thing that only brings countries together over time. So I think that's one area that I'd like to focus on, is that developing that historical relationship with the diaspora is something that across governments, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs has been keen to do. I mean, Sushma Swaraj had a very strong relationship with diaspora populations, not only just through official policies, but through her Twitter account, things like going in the Middle East as well, taking care of these historical Indian populations, like in Operation Rahat, when we had ships go to Yemen to help save some of the people there who were trapped during the coup that was going on just a few years back, and one that also saved American citizens, Canadian citizens as well. It was a very successful operation. So, and Minister Jaishankar himself, as we talked about, has specifically identified the diaspora as a key priority of any nation, any great power's foreign policy is taking care of the diaspora as a key mandate of any great power. So that's one area, I think, in which broader convergence between Canada and India and United States and India and United Kingdom and India is possible in the strength and vitality of its diaspora populations.
Okay, Anvesh, thank you. Kanti and Sudarshan, we'll close with you 1 minute each. If you could give us just a preview of where things are going in India, given the I guess a post-pandemic world and a Biden presidency or post-Biden presidency. Next 2 to 5 years, each of you, some predictions or some possible futures or scenarios. 1 minute each, Kanti, and then Sudarshan to close.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, very briefly. I mean, I think the next 3 years are going to be very, very, very difficult for India. On COVID, I mean, the chances of getting a vaccine are at least, I would think, 2 years away, maybe 3 years away. And then you've got to get 1.3 billion people or some very substantial fraction of them taken care of. So there's still going to be a very big COVID problem. The economy, the IMF says we're going to rebound in India to 8% next year, 8% growth. Seems highly unlikely. Most of the Indian economists on the ground in India are talking about 4 or 5. And getting back to 7 or 8% growth rates, I would say probably 5 years away at least. So very, very difficult. And I think the way Mr. Modi has embarked or, turned a blind eye to kind of growing right-wing nationalism, I just assume that as things get worse, that'll kick in even further to consolidate himself politically and distract attention. So everything looks bad to me. And the problem with China is going to be severe. We get through the winter now because it's not a time to fight, but who knows what the spring and summer will bring. And the Chinese, it looks like, are prepared to be pretty hard-nosed. So I would say India is not in a good space for the next 3 to 5 years.
Sudarshan.
Instead of learning lessons from China about how you deal with dissent, India would do very well to remember it's a federal polity, that we have states, provinces as you would call them, and that we have tried to empower the local and the district administration as a third tier of governance. Now, what China does very well, we don't know the mysteries of how the Politburo gets selected and who's looking over whose shoulders as to who might get stabbed in the back and so on. But what happens at the local level is that the local population and its satisfaction with local government is taken very seriously by the party. And whenever there is serious concerns among the local people and they express that, there is a change in the administration and in the regime. India, for instance, we pioneered a system which is called the Bangalore Report Card, which gets citizens' perceptions on how the sewage system, the garbage collection system, the water supply, electricity, and so on have been handled. Year after year in Bangalore, that's been an atrocious report, stating a very sad state of affairs, but there's not one single officer in the Bangalore municipality who's been held accountable for this sorry state of affairs with respect to Bangalore's population. So why can't we learn a lesson about how you deal with this? Now, you don't have to deal with this in some autocratic top-down Communist Party way. You could deal with this with some good, reasonable norms of accountability that are enforced at the local level. So I think one major concern, and this is a lesson this government is going to learn. I think its assumption that somehow this Hindutva thing will take it forward is not going to work. It's not going to work in Kerala. It will not work in Tamil Nadu. It's kind of hovering in Karnataka, but it's not there in Andhra and Telangana, nowhere in the south. And so they need to be able to first learn that it is a federal polity and this centralized form of administration, a kind of imitating Xi Jinping or a presidential form like Donald Trump, is not going to work in India. This is a hard lesson that the present regime and the party behind it will have to learn. And I hope that a few elections at the local level, including the one at the local level in Kashmir, will bring home some lessons that are useful for future governance in this country. And that needs to be prioritized, because this whole crisis and its consequences of COVID can only be handled by a well-equipped, empowered, capable district administration.
Sudarshan, an inspired ending, and we didn't get to Indian federalism and some of the dynamics there. That's for another conference and panel and intervention. Thank you for bringing that up. Sudarshan, thanks, and hello to friends and colleagues at Jindal U in New Delhi. Kanti, to friends and colleagues at the LKY school in Singapore, and Anvesh, have a wonderful day in Toronto and a great weekend. Dhanyavad.
Thank you.
Thank you.